Part 5, Section 2, Chapter 20 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, The Transcendentalists. The Transcendental movement had its origin in a band of Unitarian scholars and thinkers, mostly young men, earnest, aggressive, and completely dissatisfied with the old order of things. In September, 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Frederick H. Hedge, George Ripley, and George Putnam met together in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to discuss measures for the bringing in of the better day. Each man, as Emerson intimated, "carried a revolution in his waistcoat pocket." But the truth of history must be told. The revolutions never came out of their hiding places. Other meetings were held. These were fitful and without any special prearrangement. The meeting at Emerson's house in Concord, in that same month of September, was called by the public the meeting of the Transcendental Club. There was really no organized movement. It was simply an undefined fellowship of thoughtful and original men in great good humor with themselves, but thoroughly out of humor with the ruling doctrines of the Church, and bent on realizing, they knew not how, an ideal quite independent of Christianity. George Ripley, one of the best of the original band, thus states the creed of the Transcendentalists: "There is a class of persons who desire a reform in the prevailing philosophy of the day. These are called Transcendentalists, because they believe in an order of truths which transcends the sphere of the external senses. Their leading idea is the supremacy of mind over matter. Hence they maintain that the truth of religion does not depend on tradition nor historical facts, but has an unerring witness in the soul. There is a light, they believe, which enlighteneth every man that cometh into the world. There is a faculty in all, the most degraded, the most ignorant, the most obscure, to perceive spiritual truth when distinctly presented. And the ultimate appeal on all moral questions is not to a jury of scholars, a hierarchy of divines, or the prescriptions of a creed, but to the common sense of the human race." Individuals differing very widely in their convictions were brought together. They were united by the common belief in the supremacy of the individual reason, of the intuitions of the soul, and of the immediate apprehension of spiritual truth by the native power of man. To them human nature itself was divine. Chief among the Transcendentalists was Ralph Waldo Emerson, both a lover and a critic of the movement. He was a man of delightful spirit, and wrote with inimitable subtlety and grace. His name reflects immortal honor upon American letters. He came from a family famed for its religious distinction, in which were 8 generations of preachers. Not in theology, however, or in the theological spirit, but in letters and philosophical glimpses, it may be said Emerson was the rare flower of the New England stock. He graduated from Harvard University in 1821, and in 1829 became pastor of the Second Unitarian Church of Boston. In 1832 he resigned his pastorate on account of his growing lack of sympathy with everything distinctive of Christianity. Later he became unwilling to offer public prayer, and at length retired from all association with ecclesiastical affairs. He then devoted himself entirely to writing and lecturing. He made no pretension whatever to any consistency or constructiveness of thought, but there is always something marvelously vital, suggestive, and stimulating in his writings. He was an intuitionalist, pure and simple. He left no philosophical system, no school, and in religion he steadily drifted farther away from theism into a sort of pale pantheism. His life was remarkably pure and beautiful, and his constant plea for the things of the spirit was not without its influence against the rising materialism. The Transcendentalists, at the outset, were men of sane and moderate intentions. They broached no visionary reforms. They were not iconoclasts. But between 1830 and 1850 the air was full of radical proposals for a reconstructed world, and the wildest social and religious theories were set forth. These the Transcendentalists rather encouraged than frowned upon, so that the opprobrium of these movements fell upon those who had little or nothing in common with them. Frothingham quotes from Emerson a description of the conventions of the Friends of Universal Progress, held in 1840 in Chardon Street, Boston. "The singularity and latitude of the summons drew together from all parts of New England, and also from the Middle States, men of every shade of opinion, from the straitest orthodoxy to the wildest heresy, and many persons whose church was a church of one member only. A great variety of dialect and of costume was noticed. A great deal of confusion, eccentricity, and freak appeared, as well as of zeal and enthusiasm. Mad men, mad women, men with beards, Dunkers, Muggletonians, come-outers, groaners, agrarians, Seventh-day Baptists, Quakers, abolitionists, Calvinists, Unitarians, and philosophers, all came successively to the top, and seized their moment, if not their hour, wherein to chide, or pray, or preach, or protest. If there was not parliamentary order, there was life, and the assurance of that constitutional love for religion and religious liberty which in all periods characterizes the inhabitants of this part of America. These men and women were in reach of something better and more satisfying than a vote or a definition." The Transcendentalists themselves inaugurated an experiment at West Roxbury, Massachusetts, for the realization of human brotherhood, personal equality, and the combination of intellectual pursuits with manual labor. It was a small agricultural colony, organized, not on a communistic, but on a socialistic and cooperative basis. The Articles of Association were drawn up in September, 1841. The prime leaders were George Ripley, Charles A. Dana, Minot Pratt, and William B. Allen. Nathaniel Hawthorne also bought stock, and Theodore Parker, the great Channing, and other men of eminence gave it their sympathy. Personal property and individual rights and tastes were respected. The colony numbered about 150. Some joined to see how such an industrial experiment would work, and others were impelled by the desire to realize the democratic ideal of Christ. In the Dial, which was the great transcendental organ, Miss Elizabeth Peabody describes the Institute as an attempt to establish upon earth the city of God. "We have hitherto heard of Christ by the hearing of the ear," she says. "Now let us see him, let us be him, and see what will come of that. Let us communicate with each other and live." The male members of the Institute worked at farming, gardening, and other pursuits according to their liking, and many of them in teaching, which was the most remunerative part of their work. Some of the members, like Mr. and Mrs. Ripley, Dana, John S. Dwight, and George P. Bradford, were competent scholars, and they had no lack of pupils. In 1845 the Brook Farm Association was turned into a Fourierist phalanx. On the evening of March 3rd, 1846, the phalanstery was burned, and the interesting experiment of Brook Farm was abandoned, 1847, amid crushing financial losses. Brook Farm is a romantic episode in American history. Of the sincerity of purpose and noble enthusiasm of its promoters there can be no doubt. Frothingham thinks that the introduction of Fourierism was one of the chief causes of its downfall. It smothered its joyous and free spirit by too much mechanism and rule. "The idealists lingered last, loath to leave a spot endeared by so many associations, hallowed by so many hopes. One of the last to go, one of the saddest of heart, one of the most self-sacrificing through it all, was John S. Dwight. It may truly be said that Brook Farm died in music." But the men who planted it never lost faith in the principles it embodied. Hawthorne used to speak of his old and affectionately remembered home at Brook Farm. In the same spirit Dana wrote long after of the "great pleasure to look back upon the days when we were together, and to believe that the ends for which we then labored are sure at last, in good time, to be realized for mankind." End of chapter 20.